Stalinism in France by Cornelius Castoriadis. This was originally published in 1947. A few preliminary remarks are indispensable. There was a time not so long ago when the question of Stalinism was not raised in the party on a practical level. In any case, not in a way that differs from how it is employed by reformism. Stalinism was a, quote, traitorous, end quote, party. It was understood to be a little more traitorous and at the same time a little more left-wing than social democracy, just by a point. In these happy times just over a year ago, Comrade Blebtru, then Secretary General of the Parti Communiste Internationaliste, PCI, declared to the Central Committee that we did not have to become obsessed with distinguishing ourselves from Stalinism. After that, people immediately went back to charting the ups and downs of the mass movement. This happened in the spring of 1946. At the Third Congress of the PCI, when I see PCI, I always think of the Italian Communist Party, but that's not what this is. This is the Parti Communiste Internationaliste. Anyway, at the Third Congress of the PCI, it was practically the same thing. In their speeches, the comrades of the Frank tendency did not deign to bother themselves with Stalinism. Since then, something has changed. Under pressure from a left wing of the party, which was weak at first but grew constantly stronger as it used this issue in its struggle against the right wing, these same comrades finally, quote, discovered, end quote, Stalinism. Nevertheless, their attitude deep down remains the same. Later on, we will discuss the demagogy of the current minority wing that, while howling all along about the need for a, quote, relentless, end quote, struggle against Stalinism, not only does not propose any slogan, any concrete means for conducting this struggle, but with its basic outlook, defense of the USSR, quote, for a PCPS-CGT government, end quote, and CGT fetishism, does everything it can to reinforce the Stalinist influence within the proletariat. What interests us here is the manner in which these comrades, quote, analyze, end quote, Stalinism, how with their, quote, theoretical appraisal, end quote, they prepare the party for war in its struggle against Stalinism. This, quote, theory, end quote, of Stalinism can be summed up in a few words. The CP is, quote, a reformist party of a new kind, end quote, in the service, quote, not only of the bourgeoisie, but especially of the Kremlin, end quote. That is it. This is the key to understanding all the political phenomena of our age. There is not much to it. These, quote, theoreticians, end quote, state that the CP is, quote, a reformist party of a new kind, end quote, and yet they don't even ask themselves the following question. But why then would there be two reformist parties? Why two reformist parties at the same time when, according to Lenin's theory, for whom reformism already was an anachronism in 1919, a historical relic, there should no longer be even one? If, in a pinch, we might explain the lengthy continued existence of reformist parties by consciously lagging behind reality, the birth and development of new, quote, reformist, end quote, parties that are enjoying a very stable existence in capitalism's present period of crisis must be due to some sort of historical sleight of hand. Consciousness no longer just lags behind reality. Consciousness becomes independent of reality without any difficulty. Consciousness can even go backwards. Perhaps tomorrow consciousness will give birth to parties advocating feudalism. For Lenin, reformism was not born from the masses' illusions, as the minority wing's unconscious idealism would have it. On the contrary, the masses' reformist illusions are born upon the basis of the reality of certain social reforms that are antecedent, the reality of certain social reforms that an ascendant capitalism is able to grant. The reality of these reforms on the one hand and a specific, quote, social base, end quote, on the other, labor aristocracy and trade union and political bureaucracy are, according to Lenin's materialist theory of reformism, the roots of social democracy. For the Frank tendency, maybe that's how you say it. It says Frank, but Frank seems European. In contrast, quote, a, quote, new reformism, end quote, can be born independently of all objective reality. It suffices that people have, quote, illusions, end quote, for large parties to be born and to grow. People's stupidity becomes the motive force of history. Or else, then, these, quote, reformist illusions, end quote, have a real basis, and then the minority wing would be obliged to admit that capitalism right now is conceding, quote, reforms, end quote, to the working class, and what is worse, that it is possible to concede those reforms. Thus, we in the minority wing, before anyone else, would have to revise our whole conception of this era as a period of crisis for capitalism and for a decomposition for bourgeois society. There is more. If the Communist Party is a reformist party, then we have said about the social base, what we have said about the social base of Stalinism, labor aristocracy and trade union and political bureaucracy is automatically true. As a matter of fact, for Lenin, these strata have always been the social base of social democratic reformism. Communist Party equals reformist party necessarily entails the social base of the Communist Party equals labor aristocracy, etc. Why, in that case, have they howled so loudly against the theory of social bases and, quote, its dim-witted author, end quote. But here is the real clinker. The Stalinists, quote, express at the same time the interests of their national bourgeoisie and especially those of the Kremlin. Those in the minority do not even ask whether the interest of the bourgeoisie and the Kremlin are compatible, apart of course from the times when it is a matter of crushing the proletariat. Can one serve both at once? It is obvious that the Stalinist efforts objectively benefit the bourgeoisie, especially at times when the proletarian revolution becomes a threat. But it is not the advocates of, quote, power to the CP, end quote, who will teach us this. And this is not in the least bit sufficient to describe the core of Stalinist politics, which pursues its own goals independently of all bourgeois politics, as can be seen every time, the proletarian threat having been set aside, Stalinism and the bourgeoisie confront each other in a fight to the death. Let the minority wing explain to us, for example, how and why the Greek or Chinese Stalinists, in order to serve the interest of their, quote, bourgeoisie, end quote, have found no better means than to conduct a civil war against this very same bourgeoisie. How ought the problem be posed? In order to respond to the question about Stalinism's character and role, we first must resolve the following problems. 1. Is it true or not true that the communist parties of every country evince the same policy worldwide despite possible differences in tactics? 2. Is it true or not true that this worldwide Stalinist policy is determined by the need to preserve the USSR's bureaucratic regime, to consolidate itself in the glacis, Eastern Europe, and occasionally to expand itself into other countries? 3. If the response to these two questions is yes, what factors allow the CPs to have such an influence within a very significant number of capitalist countries? For us, the answer is clear. There is no doubt about the uniformity and coherence of Stalinist policy around the world. The apparent contradictions, quote, contradictions, end quote, in the policy of various national communist parties are contradictions only in the naive view of certain Trotskyists. Tito and Dimitrov lay claim to northern Greece, and Zachariadis claims indignantly that he will defend the integrity of Greek territory against anyone. This does not prevent any of them from sitting together in the Stalinist, quote, Balkan Directorate, end quote, and jointly organizing the partisan civil war in Greece. If the Trotskyist leadership does not understand anything at the present time about Stalinist policy, it is because the Trotskyist leadership continue to see the communist parties as workers' parties that, quote, make mistakes, end quote, or that, quote, betray, end quote, instead of understanding that the policy of the CPs has its own logic and a set of tactics that follow therefrom, as determined by the specific goals of this policy. This means it is obliged to employ, and the nature of social bases upon which it depends in various countries. The orientation of this policy is no less clear. It can be characterized in general terms as, quote, defense of the USSR and its bureaucratic system, end quote. As long as, quote, defense, end quote, is not taken in a static sense, understanding that in the atomic age, quote, to defend, end quote, means to conquer the world. But here, too, we should not be misunderstood. This defense of the USSR takes many forms depending upon the country in which the Communist Party in question is acting and upon the historical situation according to circumstances. It can mean the crushing of a proletarian revolution in Spain or the extermination of the bourgeoisie in Eastern Europe. It says here in the Gallicis, I'll just say Gallicis from now on, but in the last essay that I read by Castoriadis, the footnote said Gallicis was a common term used, I guess, generally by Western powers or maybe Eastern powers, maybe just like the world at that time was using this term Gallicis to describe the entirety of what you would call the buffer zone of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, after World War II. Okay. We started out with the uniformity of Stalinist policy and the definition of its means and goals in order to facilitate understanding. Indeed, we are dealing with phenomena that are tangible for anyone who has not been completely bewildered by the International's, quote, official, end quote, mythology. For the Marxist, however, the principal and genuine question is the following. What then are the material and social bases of this policy? On this question, the minority wing obstinately remains silent. The PCF, for example, is for it, quote, a band of Stakhanovites in the pay of the Kremlin, end quote. Quote, the purely revolutionary illusions of the masses, end quote. The vulgar idealism of this explanation is quite obvious. The venality of individuals and the illusions of the masses can play a role only if they are put in the service of historical and social factors. In Marxism, a political party always expresses the material and social interest of a particular social stratum. What is this stratum in France, whose material interests are expressed by the Communist Party of France? That is the real question. For the minority wing, this stratum is the Kremlin's clique. By what kind of conjuring away of all historical and sociological laws can a, quote, clique, end quote, from a foreign country win the allegiance of the majority of a proletariat it is constantly deceiving and betraying? Only the detective novel imagination of the minority wing's leaders could explain this to us. Sad to say, the minority wing offers us nothing more about Stalinism than the parole française. I don't know if I'm saying Francais. Maybe it's parole français. I don't know. Theory of, quote, Moscow's fifth column, end quote. As for us, the obvious connection between the policy of the PCF and the policy of Moscow only makes it more pressing to identify the social strata in France whose interests tally with those of the Soviet bureaucracy to such an extent that they can be expressed in the same policy. That is what we have always meant by the, quote, social base of Stalinism in France, end quote. The social base of the Communist Party of France. In Marxist terminology, the, quote, social base, end quote, of a party means the social stratum whose material interests are really expressed by this party and that follows this party, not because it is mystified or deceived by it, but because it is connected with it in an organic way. It is obvious that this means neither that all the individuals of this stratum follow the party in question, nor that all those who follow it belong to this stratum. But the party expresses in the final analysis the interests of this stratum, and it derives its basic strength from it, not in the numerical sense, but in the social sense. It is in this sense that we have defined the labor aristocracy and the political and trade union bureaucracy as the social base of the Communist Party of France. At this point, a historical explanation is necessary. In the period of capitalism's ascendancy, these strata were what Lenin had defined as the social base of reformism. The whole historical combination of circumstances as well as their social position, which drew them closer to the petty bourgeoisie than to the proletariat, turned the politics of the party that had expressed the political voice of these strata into a bourgeois politics within the working class. In the period of capitalism's decline, the problem arises on a completely different basis. A, quote, labor aristocracy, end quote, does not cease to exist despite the overall crisis of the system. Obviously, it does not enjoy the same standard of living as before. But it continues to enjoy privileges compared to the great mass of workers, and even more so today than yesterday. These two factors determine its political aspirations. On the one hand, the overall crisis of the capitalist system, tangibly experienced every day, and the fall in its standard of living have destroyed the reformist mentality within this stratum. Continued, quote, progress, end quote, within the capitalist system appears completely utopian. The parasitic role of the bosses has become plain for everyone to see. The Russian example has shown that, quote, technicians, end quote, bureaucrats, and the, quote, capable people, end quote, can run the economy and the state without the bosses. On the other hand, their specific interests, their differentiation from the proletariat, the fact that the proletarian revolution is overdue, prove to them that the proletariat is incapable of imposing its own historical solution. Their aspiration to remain a privileged stratum takes them off the road to revolution. Quite naturally, then, they rally to the Communist Party of France, which claims to be the enemy of the bourgeoisie and of, quote, capitalist chaos, end quote, as well as the promoter of an economically rationalized society which has a place for genuinely privileged strata, which makes sure the proletariat keeps working by keeping it on a tight leash, and which promises to kick out the bourgeois parasites. As for the trade union and political bureaucracy, it is a stratum whose size and effectiveness cannot be underestimated. The people who at the present time hold positions in the trade unions or in politics, thanks to their adherence and allegiance to the Communist Party of France, number in France at a minimum several tens of thousands. Their allegiance guarantees their material existence, and they know that in case there is a total victory of the Communist Party of France, they would be the undisputed masters of society. Their rabid opposition to any autonomous proletarian movement that might upset their schemings and maneuverings is only stronger and more resolute for these reasons. From a political point of view, this analysis is of great import. It is the only one capable of explaining the relative stability that the Communist Party of France enjoys. Welded to Stalinism through their interests, these strata provide the Communist Party of France with a material foundation within the proletariat. They weigh down on the rest of the class as they occupy posts of responsibility. They are the relatively firm base that gives the Communist Party of France room to maneuver and provides a continuity to its politics. Taken as a whole, these factors have allowed us to see in advance that outflanking it would be infinitely more difficult and more complicated than the minority wing previously has said it would be, precisely because Stalinism is not a thin stratum superficially overlaying a proletariat that remains altogether alien to it. Rather, it is a body resting on top of a specific and well-defined social base that penetrates into the proletariat, and with its many tentacles is a good is in a good position to keep a tight grip on it. For the minority wing, in contrast, the, quote, difficulty, end quote, of outflanking Stalinism that they have belatedly discovered is just a glaring afterthought, clashing with their entire view of Stalinism. Sorry, 1 second. The social composition of the PCF, the proletariat's illusions. As opposed to what is happening in the countries of the Glacis or in Greece, where the percentage of workers in the CP is quite small, in France the social composition of the CP is principally working class. The PCF is born of the proletariat. It has strength against the bourgeoisie only through the working class. A massive defeat of the latter would mean a considerable loss for it too. If that is the case, it is of the highest importance to have a clear image of the nature of the illusions of the working class members of the PCF and to analyze the ways in which they adhere to Stalinist policy. First, we must rule out the theory of the party's right wing concerning the, quote, reformist illusions, end quote, of Stalinist workers. Only Trotskyist leaders have reformist illusions about the PCF. Let us note, on the other hand, the logical consequence of the minority wing's incoherent view of Stalinism. If the Communist Party is a, quote, reformist party, end quote, the workers who follow it ought to do so on the basis of reformist illusions. We have never seen workers who follow a, quote, reformist, end quote, party on the basis of, quote, revolutionary illusions, end quote. But this upsets the minority's wing's efforts at, quote, permanent radicalization, end quote. On the contrary, a further contradiction does not even scare them off. They rashly proclaim that the workers are following the Communist Party on the basis of a, quote, pure, end quote, yet, quote, superficially duped, end quote, revolutionary consciousness, end quote, while the Communist Party nevertheless remains a, quote, reformist, end quote, party. It is undoubtedly true that a certain extremely limited number of workers follow the CP on the basis of reformism, and that some others, either very young or faithful to their party's revolutionary past, though superficially duped, are, so to speak, quote, Stalinists by mistake, end quote. But the overwhelming majority of the pro-Stalinist workers are tinged in part with Stalinist ideology. They are convinced that the Communist Party wants to overthrow the bourgeoisie and instaurate a new society where exploitation would be, quote, limited, end quote. But they also are persuaded that the party is a supreme authority that transcends them. That alone is conscious and responsible. Their confidence is undermined by the spontaneous power of the masses. For the most part, it is not they who launch struggles. They make up the mass of those who will follow along in the best of cases. They are those who, in a period of revolutionary growth, will even end up breaking with Stalinism. On the other hand, during each period of retreat, they will line up behind Stalinism. In best of cases, it will be difficult to get them in line. To think that Stalinism could weigh down on the workers as it has over the years without affecting them is a delirious fabrication. Because problems of consciousness are in the last analysis secondary, and because the proletariat in a period of struggle evolves rapidly, determined in its course by its interests, the vanguard can lead the most apathetic strata as well as those infiltrated by Stalinism. For this reason, we do not see in this a decisive element. But this analysis of the illusions of the workers who follow the CP ought to help us once again to understand the proper timing for outflanking the CP and the difficulties involved in doing so. And in particular, it ought to help us carry on effectively our propaganda efforts by attacking the mystifications of Stalinism at their source, i.e., on the question of the USSR. The, quote, middle strata, end quote, and the social composition of Stalinism. No one in the party denies that since the, quote, liberation, end quote, Stalinism has made great inroads into the middle classes, and yet strangely the importance of this phenomenon has been underestimated. We reject the conception of the party's right wing, according to which the middle classes are going over to Stalinism today as they went over to radicalism before, as well as that of the frank minority wing, which sees in this movement a kind of, quote, radicalization, end quote. Reality is not somewhere in between these incorrect assertions, it is totally different. We cannot determine why large sections of the middle strata are joining the PCF by taking into account only the outward appearance of its program. The bourgeoisie's hostility to the Communist Party and to its international ties leaves no doubt about its allegedly, quote, radical, end quote, character. On the other hand, the CP constantly proclaims itself to be the fervent partisan of purging and exterminating the people's enemies and oppressors, of the struggle against the trusts, of the great structural reforms, of great structural reforms. The CP constantly proclaims itself to be the fervent partisan of purging and exterminating the people's enemies and oppressors, of the struggle against the trusts, and of great structural reforms, and yet it would be just as wrong to ignore the clearly counter-revolutionary policy of the Communist Party and to see in it, as the frank minority wing does, a, quote, progressive pole of attraction, end quote, for the middle classes. It is no accident that these classes joined the Communist Party when it began developing a policy openly opposed to the interests of the proletariat, when it began preaching the necessity of avoiding revolution and disapproving of the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. We must understand that the situation of the, quote, middle classes, end quote, is today and what their aspirations are. The crisis of the system has hit the petty bourgeois terribly hard. Trotsky already has explained that while the French petty bourgeoisie usually has been both strongly in favor of maintaining order and hostile to extreme solutions, nevertheless, at certain times, when driven by despair and overcome by crisis, it inevitably has been led to search feverishly for salvation behind a leader, whether it be the proletariat or fascism. More than ever, the current crisis of the system has removed a significant number of the middle strata from the traditional, quote, democratic, end quote, parties. At the time of the, quote, liberation, end quote, fascism could not show its face. An autonomous revolutionary proletarian politics was not appearing on the scene either. Given the bankruptcy of the traditional parties, only the Communist Party, with its totalitarian structure, its powerful propaganda, its clever demagogy, and the particular care with which it applied itself to the conquest of the middle classes, was seen as having a clear-cut set of features. It is not surprising that the Communist Party appeared to a significant number of petty bourgeois to be a savior with respect to big business as well as to the proletariat. The myths of the, quote, new democracy, end quote, essentially is addressed. The myth of the, quote, new democracy, end quote, essentially is addressed to these strata. Several themes hark back constantly to the middle class's habits of speech. 1. The struggle against the trusts. All evils issue from this handful of vampires who feast upon society, unleash economic crises, carry on behind the scenes a fascist policy, and want war so they can put everything at the disposal of the great American trust. The Communist Party will destroy the trust and will put the great well springs of the economy back into the hands of the people. That seems like a very important point, even though, because it reminds me of, what's the word? I think it's Leo Löwenthal in the Anxiety and Politics essay. I think it's up on YouTube, but it talks about the false concretizations being the psychological product of impersonal forces beyond the control of particular groups. I don't know. Sorry. That whole last bit reminds me of some of the critiques of anti-Semitism that have come out of critical theory-oriented Marxism. Okay. Sorry, that wasn't a very insightful comment, but anyway. 2. Only by relying on the proletariat, quote, the great progressive force in history, end quote, only by relying on the proletariat, quote, the great progressive force in history, end quote, will we be able to wipe out the vampires. But the proletariat itself has its duties to work under the CP's discipline and enlightened direction. Only traitors strike in a, quote, popular democracy, end quote. Unions, which are the best servants of the state, keep order. 3. The new society will be rationalized on the economic level. There will be a plan, crises will be banished, and social stability will be assured. 4. The middle classes, especially intellectuals and technicians, are implicitly invited to become the cadres of the new society, for the proletariat will have need of cadres. The relationship between this mythology and that of fascism is manifest. Fascism howls about the struggle against the trust. See, I was fucking right, man. I'm so fucking smart. Jesus Christ, dude. I knew this was fucking coming. I can see into the goddamn future. It promises jobs. It promises social discipline. It even pretends to rely on the, quote, real workers, end quote. That's an important phrase right there. The, quote, real workers, end quote. The real hard-working people versus those nebulous, artificial East Coast elites with their, whatever. You know how the logic, you know how the psychology is. Anyway, it promises jobs, it promises social discipline, it even pretends to rely on the, quote, real workers, end quote. It promises emancipation to the middle classes in particular. Like Stalinism, it says to them, in short, quote, you who have no independence, who have been crushed by the feudal lords of the economy, you will finally run the state, end quote. But in reality, the mystification of Stalinism is much more thorough. Fascism engages in pure demagogy. It preaches the struggle against the trusts. But fascism is the trust's instrument. Fascism promises the triumph of the middle classes, but fascism crushes the middle classes after taking power. Only a thin layer can be accommodated in the fascist politico-military bureaucracy. Stalinism, in contrast, actually fights against the trusts. Certainly according to Stalinism's own methods, but it is a fact that where it has power, it dispossesses and usually wipes out the big capitalists. The experience of the, quote, Gallicis, end quote, the Eastern Bloc, is there as conclusive evidence for all but the blind. On the other hand, in order to fulfill the requirements of its economic policy, which depends upon continuous state growth, and by carrying out its social policy, which requires a large base of support against both the bourgeoisie and against the proletariat, it actually prepares for the triumph of a new strata that are to form its political and economic bureaucracy. Incidentally, the character of these ties between certain strata of the petty bourgeoisie and Stalinism also explains the slowness with which fascism has been able to rebuild itself in France. Conclusions. I'm in a good mood right now. I was starting this essay. I was like, man, I don't feel like fucking reading this shit. I don't feel like doing this. And as I've read, I'm like, oh, this is a very interesting little piece here. Conclusions. If the party's right wing really is becoming adjusted to Stalinism and is seeking only to, quote, move Stalinism to the left, end quote, the frank minority wing itself has a subtler but equally dangerous method of adaptation. The slogans, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, and, quote, for a PC, PS, CGT government, end quote, the simplistic move toward, quote, replacing the leaders of the CGT, end quote, the idea that the CP might be transformed, quote, under pressure from the masses, end quote, the idea of an automatic outflanking of Stalinism, this whole set of catastrophic errors capable of their own capable on their own of stifling a future revolutionary situation, has a common theoretical source. They confuse the Communist Party with reformism. The experience in the Galicis, where Stalinism is wiping out the capitalist class more and more, both economically and politically, and is pushing society down the road toward assimilation with the USSR, does not even exist for these comrades. Unable to understand that the Stalinist strategy, conquest of state power, occurs in various countries in various ways and through various tactics, they pose such puerile questions as, quote, if things are as you say, then why doesn't the CP take power in France, end quote, without seeing that, beyond the risks of being outflanked that this would entail for them, and against which they had been protected in the countries of the Galicis by the presence of the Red Army, such an endeavor for the Stalinists of 1944, as well as of today, would immediately unleash war between the Soviet Union and the United States, a war they wish to delay as long as possible. These comrades are so blind that they have swallowed whole the pronouncements for petty bourgeois consumption of Thérèse and the company concerning, Thérèse and company, not the company, Thérèse and company concerning the, quote, peaceful conquest, end quote, of power, declarations whose true value fools neither the bourgeoisie nor the partisans of the CP. Alright, I gotta see how that guy's fucking name is pronounced. So, let's see, you're gonna come with me to the old YouTube, or the old Google Translate. French to English, okay. Let's see, type in the name, Thérèse, and it says, drumroll, let's turn that volume up.
Thérèse. Thérèse.
Thérèse, I was right, motherfucker. These comrades are so blind that they have swallowed whole the pronouncements for petty bourgeois consumption of Thérèse and company concerning the, quote, peaceful conquest, end quote, of power, declarations whose true value fools neither the bourgeoisie nor the partisans of the CP. Their inability to understand anything at all about the phenomenon of Stalinism can be measured by the vulgarity of the concoctions to which they are obliged to have recourse in order to, quote, refute, end quote, our account of Stalinism. Thus, when the authors of the Minority Wing's thesis write, quote, if the CP is a new class in the process of formation, all the organizations that depend on the CP or that the CP controls represent organic components of this class and of this class's future domination. Thus, the unions may be compared to the imperialist army, i.e. to a body constituted by the class enemy that ought to be smashed, end quote. The fervor they exhibit while drawing the, quote, logical consequences, end quote, from our position, and which is completely lacking when it comes to drawing conclusions from their own positions, can be turned completely against them. We have never said that the CP is, quote, a new class in the process of formation, end quote. Do these comrades have to be taught that a party is never a class, that it is only its political expression, and that even in the USSR, it is not the Communist Party that is the dominant class, but the infinitely more immense bureaucracy, the Communist Party being only that bureaucracy's instrument? We have explained only that the Communist Party, like every political party, has to express the material interest of a social stratum, and we have tried to define this stratum. For them, the Communist Party expresses only the treachery of Thérèse and the stupidity of the masses that follow him. It is easy to see where genuine Marxist analysis is to be found, as concerns the, quote, consequences, end quote, for the trade unions. They call to mind their logic, the famous 1936 deductions, end quote, of Lyshinsky. Quote, you are against the regime, therefore you are advocates of sabotage, end quote. The Minority Wing says to us, quote, if the Communist Party is a new class, question mark, that's a question mark in parentheses, The unions are its organic components, therefore they should be smashed, end quote. The monumental absurdity of this kind of, quote, reasoning, end quote, is manifest. The unions are for us above all the rallying point of the working class. Our attitude is not changed by the fact that the Stalinist bureaucracy dominates the unions, just as it has not changed before when the reformist agents of capital dominated the unions. And another thing, in order to win them over, we are proposing a tactic, committees of struggle, that differs from the opportunistic and ineffective tactics of Lambert. Going to the translator again. Lambert.
Lambert. Lambert.
Lambert. Hey, I said it wrong, but I got the last part right. Lambert. When, on the other hand, the minority wing accuses us of defining a class, quote, by how much of the national income it consumes, end quote, all they have done is reinvent the wheel. We are the first to explain that it is precisely because the strata that form the social basis of Stalinism in capitalist countries have no independent position with respect to the means of production, that they cannot be characterized as a, quote, class, end quote, but rather only as a social, quote, stratum, end quote. Only if they come to power and have complete domination over the apparatus of production, as has happened in Russia and is occurring in the Glacis, they will become a class in the full sense of this term. The final question is posed: if all this is true, if the Communist Party if all this is true, is the Communist Party still a, quote, working class party, end quote? We answer: if by working class party you mean a party made up mostly by workers who consider it as such, then the Communist Party undeniably is a working class party. But posed in this way, the question is merely scholastic. Apropos of social democracy, Lenin already had explained that this, quote, working class party, end quote, was in fact capital's agent within the working class movement. It is by starting out with this kind of analysis that we can resolve the political problems raised by Stalinism. Precisely because we are taking the working class composition of the Communist Party of France into account, we believe that the policy of the United Front with the PCF cannot be ruled out a priori, independent of the fact that today it generally is impracticable for other reasons. On the other hand, the slogan, quote, for a PCPS-CGT government, end quote, is the most glaring proof of the opportunism to which the intention of determining one's politics solely on the basis of the, quote, working class nature, end quote, of the CP is led. The problem of outflanking Stalinism. This conception allows us to understand the process of outflanking Stalinism and its timing. The difficulty and the complexity involved are for us not a concession to reality as they are for the Franc minority wing, but the clear result of an analysis of the social basis of Stalinism, which confers upon it a relative degree of stability, as well as of the nature of the illusions of the masses who follow Stalinism. On the other hand, it is precisely the Communist Party's heterogeneous character, the fact that its support comes not from a class with an autonomous position within the production process, but rather from strata whose ideological crystallization is due only to the fact that the proletarian revolution is overdue, that makes the outflanking of Stalinism remain an ever-present possibility, but on the condition that the party carries out a revolutionary, non-opportunistic politics. What we need are not useless verbal attacks that only serve to hide a de facto capitulation to Stalinism. First off, we need to explain patiently the complete workings and material roots of Stalinism's betrayal. On the other hand, above all, we need to propel this tactic of outflanking into action through appropriate slogans. We will come back to this in our third chapter. For the moment, let us state that if the minority wing has finally discovered the necessity of struggling against Stalinism, it has done nothing to change its tag-along political style.